understand there's something going on with the DNR on the other side, going west. Us folks over here in Gerrish, we read what we read in the papers, although we do not border the National Guard base. So we're kind of like distant cousins. So I called Colonel Meyers and asked if he would come over and speak, primarily to our residents at Gerrish Township that may not be as well informed as to what has been happening with the Guard base. And so I'm glad you came, and I want to be clear about the format tonight. Colonel Meyers and gentlemen from the DNR are here to make a presentation, and at the end of their presentation, we'll be very happy to take questions from the public. I want to be clear that we want to take questions. We don't want people to stand up and editorialize and this and that and the other thing, but ask substantive questions. That's why we're here. We're here to learn, and the time for editorializing is back at your home with your friends, or do whatever you want. But I think to keep the meeting fair to both you and to Colonel Meyers, let's just keep questions, like I said, as substantive questions. We don't have a large group here tonight. I really expected with the local interest in what is happening there, I thought we'd have a larger crowd. In fact, I was looking in the closet this morning. We still had some more chairs, and I thought, well, we're gonna have to bring out some more chairs. But so maybe with a smaller crowd, we can give you a second bite at the apple, so to speak, with a question. And so, again, I want to welcome you here to Gerrish Township. How many people are from Gerrish Township? Raise your hand. How many people are not from Gerrish Township? Okay, that's fine. So anyway, I want to welcome you, and at this time I'm going to turn the microphone over to Colonel Meyers, and welcome, guys.
Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Just a quick introduction. I'm Colonel Scott Meyers. I'm the installation commander at Camp Grayling, and a little bit about what we asked of the DNR, and obviously we've gotten we've had quite a bit of comment period for quite a bit. But back in 2019, the Chiefs of Staff, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, came up with a new national defense strategy, and they published that. And it changed the way that we were directing, or changed the way that military training was to be conducted. And that national defense strategy, of course, is based on threats that they see throughout the globe, different challenges that they see. And so over the last several decades, the military, of course, has been focused on Iraq and Afghanistan, which are more brigade-centric operations in a particular environment of the world. And that had been the primary focus, I guess, for the Department of Defense for several years. What we saw with different threats or capabilities of potential harmful actors throughout the world kind of floored the military a little bit. We saw some things that we weren't ready for, and so the shift of training doctrine went from those more brigade, what we call centric operations in that CENTCOM area of operation to more of a global type threat environment. So when we looked at that, the new training doctrine focuses around what we call MDO, or multi-domain operations. And so what that means, multi-domain operations mean, is the military has trained extremely well. The land of the military is pretty much, if you think of the Army, those things that the Army does, artillery, infantry, engineers, those assets that you typically have seen in movies, I guess, of what an Army typically does. Another domain is sea, so think of the Navy and the domain that the Navy typically focuses on. The third domain is air, so think of the Air Force and having freedom of maneuver in the skies and how the Air Force trains. And then we've seen a couple new domains added with capabilities that we've seen, especially when you look at things of China as an example, where we had freedom of maneuver in space, satellites. We obviously depend on those all the time with our GPS and other things. Now we see the ability that those could be threatened. Cyber, of course, and cyber is a very broad term. It kind of not only affects all of our domains, but there's many definitions of cyber, including electronic warfare attacks, or hacking, or jamming, or all those types of things. So what the doctrine focused on was how do you train in all 5 of those domains simultaneously. We have to do better on preparing our men and women who serve with the tools necessary to win and succeed in those types of environments, right? So that's what we do. And out at Camp Grayling, I think a misnomer has been that it's just a quiet little National Guard training facility. Certainly couldn't be further from the truth. We've trained active duty. Just this past year, our Northern Strike exercise, which is our largest exercise annually, we had just under 9,000 soldiers, Army soldiers, active duty, Guard, and reservists. We had Air Force, Air National Guard. We had Navy SEALs. We had special operators from the Special Forces. We had 1,000 Marines on ground. And we also trained some of our allied partners who we depend on to fight alongside us. So as an example, those are kind of our larger exercises. So as we're doing this analysis of how we're going to get after and train service members in those multi-domain operations, some of our capabilities were lacking. And so what were those capabilities? And a lot of those capabilities were getting after distances. So how do we replicate greater distances for EW type effects? How do we work on greater distances to stress our communications? How do we get in those different areas to better camouflage? And what do you look like from space? If your adversaries have satellites and can view you from space, certainly that wasn't a threat in Iraq and Afghanistan, but in those environments it could be. So how do we best train and defend our service members by those new tools, if you will? So some of those shortcomings, again, we're getting out to those distances. And so I think it's been about 1.5 years now, maybe a year ago, the team looked at the maps that Grayling currently owns, the areas that we have our long-term lease agreements with the DNR, the areas that we have short-term lease agreements with the DNR, and then other state lands that were contiguous to those training areas. And so we mapped out areas that we thought we could get out to those greater distances. We're still going to have to train in our what we call high-impact training areas. Think of the bombings and the artillery fire and the jets and all that stuff up in our 40 complex and up north. However, for these new areas, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about smaller formations of troops with wheeled vehicles, using existing lands and trails, areas that we would not or could not close to the public. They would remain open. And so we're looking at, how can we expand that and then still be good stewards to the neighbors, good stewards for our environment, et cetera. So as we developed that, we presented an ask to the DNR Director, is that February? Late January. Proposed that. The director at the time allowed us to move forward with the process of going through and analyzing that request, as well as opening early public comments. And so typically with land use agreements, you kind of wait that process out, and then when you have that final agreement in place, that's usually when you open to public comment. We wanted to get in front of that a little bit. I don't know if it was good or bad from my seat retrospect, but that's where we're at. So we have our initial request in. We know already that 162,000 acres will of course shrink with some of the concessions we've already made based on public input, training away from the waterways, obviously privately owned areas and those types of things. And then there's types of lands that the DNR has articulated to the department or our department that would be off limits as well. So I'll pause there because that's why we decided to ask for it. My chair is a little bit different. I've got a provide those best training environments for those men and women who serve, who write that blank check, including the cost of their life, to vet our freedoms. And my job is to ensure that they have the best training assets and capabilities available. So with that being said, the DNR owns those lands, of course, or manages those lands, I should say, and the process that we're in right now is the DNR process. So with that being said, I'll turn over to Tom.
Thanks, Colonel. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. My name's Tom Barnes. I'm the unit manager for the Grayling Forest Management Unit. I basically cover Crawford County, Oscoda County, Alcona, and Iosco, northern part of Iosco. And a lot of the grounds that Camp Grayling occupy or train on right now. So I'm just going to kind of give you a brief background on what agreements we have in place now, kind of the ownership, and also what activities we do there, and what how the military plays into that, and then we'll open it up for questions. So Mr. Hansen back in 1913 provided the original gift to the military. He gave them about roughly 14,000 acres to establish basically Camp Grayling. And so that was around the southwestern part of Lake Marguerite. A few years later, about a decade later, the Department of Conservation at the time gifted 18,000 acres to the military. So those lands are owned by the military. They have full control of that those lands, and we have the deeded rights to manage it. So, and then they have since then purchased their own properties through their own dollars, kind of filling in the patchwork, if you will, of vacant, or that donut hole, if you will. Or if you look at the floor, they would buy the red tiles to get everything more contiguous to lessen their impact. So their acreage right now is somewhere around 42,000 acres. So Camp Grayling's 147,000 acres. Of that, they own 42,000, and we have the management rights to that. Then in the 40s, the department entered into a long-term agreement with the military, and that was to the tune of roughly 60,000 acres. And so that would be everything east of I-75 and north of North Down River Road, pretty much. It's where the 30 complex, the air-to-ground range, it's where most of their kinetic activity is. That's where they have firing points. That's where they are shooting their howitzers into the impact areas. That's where they have live fire in the 30 complex. And that's also where the main closures are. And those closures have been going on for quite a while. The DNR Director back in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s, by director's order, closed off the 30 and 40 complex. It was not fenced at the time, so people could go in there if there was live fire or live firing going on, and obviously that probably wasn't the best thing to have happen. So the DNR Director at that time issued a director's order, and that area is restricted to only military personnel, and so those fences were erected around those complexes. And then in 1984, the military came back to the DNR, and the short-term agreement was entered into place, and that's roughly 45,000 acres. It would be pretty much the southwestern part of Crawford County and the eastern part of Kalkaska County. Now, the difference between, these last two, the long-term and short-term, we, the DNR, are the owners of that property. We have full control over that. The long-term lease, the way the lease agreement was written up, was that military training is the primary goal there. We still manage it. We still do all of our activities. The public recreation is still allowed out there, but training's number one. And so our management activities cannot conflict with the military training. So we work in partnership in managing those areas. The short-term lease lands, we have full jurisdiction on. So they are just another user of that area. There's no closures there. The activities that take place, for example, almost all of Camp Grayling was closed when Public Act 288 came into play, which is the side-by-sides and the ATVs. All that, the long-term and the acreage owned by the military was closed to ORVs. The short-term lease lands were always open and have always been open. And again, that's because we have full jurisdiction of those properties, and training is not the primary issue there. So If this ever gets to an end where we're actually going to add additional acreage, those acres would go into a short-term agreement. Anything that we have on the books now as far as guidelines, regulations that are in play, those will be carried over to the new ones. And then there's those 6 different areas. Those will also probably have unique ones as well. And as the Colonel mentioned, you know, the buffers from water bodies, you know, things like that will be, you know, rolled into that type of agreement. But they will still be open. Any activities that are existing today will continue to exist if that would ever be put into play. So, you know, keep that in mind when we talk about things. You know, there's 2 different ownerships. There's military ownership and our ownership. And I can only control, or the DNR can only control what's under their ownership. And so that's basically where we're at, and I'll be glad to open it up to the
Did you
floor.
want to talk about the process, the DNR process right now?
So the process. So we're in the public comment phase. Public comment will take place through the entirety of this process, however that long that's going to be. Right now, the director is you know, mulling everything over. I'm hoping we have a decision before the end of the year. That's the one thing I haven't been able to get a time frame from him, is when that exact date's going to be. But he does have quite a bit of data that I've supplied him, and information from all the public comments that have come in have been sent to him along with the summary. Part of my job was to look at everything that came in, put it into common themes, whether it's access issues, whether it's environmental issues, whether it's closures, you name it, whether it's even legal to do it, whether it's within our mission. We had, I don't know, probably a dozen different categories that I summarized and said, here's what the main theme is. So that's been provided to him. So it is on his desk, and like I said, hopefully we'll have a decision by the end of the year. If it gets green lighted to go to the next phase, then what we will be doing is basically a parcel review. So any parcel that they're looking to want to add to their existing agreements and want to bring into their training footprint, then we will go through and do basically an environmental assessment. Look at what's out there. What are the sensitive species, if there are any? What's the funding sources? Because some of our funding sources may or may not allow leasing. And so we have to look at that. And that will be pared down, as the Colonel mentioned before. You know, there's certain ones that I know for sure won't be allowed because of the dollars where they came from. And we've already pulled some of those out, and we'll continue to pull those out. The buffers off of the waterways, those will be pulled out. So we will update that map if and when we get the green light to go to that next phase. So once we do ours and we pare everything down and we have a new map that will be out there for everybody to see, the military will have to go through their process, and they are required by law to go through a NEPA process, and that's the federal process. That's going to take quite a bit of time, depending on whatever that footprint is going to be, because it will be individuals that haven't been on the property before. They're going to go through and basically look at everything. You know, what's existing? Is there contamination that's already there that, you know, the military doesn't want to be blamed for? Or, you know, is there something out there that they found that we didn't find? So that will be subject to public review and public comment. And again, so if we get that far and we roll through that, the public will be involved again. Again, the comment periods will never close. It'll be continued to roll through. If we get past that phase, then it will be basically drafting the agreements and coming up and saying, all right, what are we going to do for these 6 areas or whatever areas are still left, and what guidelines are we going to put into that? And again, if and when we get to that point, there will be the director has said we will have at least one large public stakeholder meeting or public input meeting, so everybody can review that. And again, it'll go through that public comment phase, and the director will have to decide again. So this isn't going to be this is not a sprint. This very much is a marathon, you know. And you know, when this first came out at our first meeting in June, I estimated by the end of 2023, I figured it would be done. I would be surprised if it's done before the middle of 24. It will take time. Will imagine that if we get to the point of the NEPA review, that'll probably be the longest part of the process. So that's kind of where we're at. We're in the public phase. We're waiting for the director to say, thumbs up, we're gonna go next phase, or thumbs down, we're done with it. If we're done with it, maybe I'll grow some hair back, I don't know. If not, you know, we'll continue on, and I'm sure we'll have more meetings and more questions coming up. So that's basically our process right now, which is very typical of any of our processes. The public roads, every year, you know, it goes through a public comment phase. We take that, those comments are looked at, it goes to the director makes that decision. Just to get out in front of some of the questions, this decision solely lies with the director of the DNR. Any of the land management, any of the land transactions are under his guidance and under his supervision and under his direction. So he is the one person that makes this decision, and it's something that I don't wish on him. You know, it's going to be a tough one. So, but with that, we'll turn it open for questions.
My first question would be for public comments. You prefer them in a written form, I would think.
Yeah, that's the primary way they've come in. So if you go to our DNR website, there's a tab called Managing Your Resources. If you click on that, it'll say Public Lands. If you click on Public Lands, I think the first one is the link to the Camp Grayling expansion. If you click on that, there's a page of frequently asked questions. And then there's also an interactive map, which, depending on what your computer system is and your internet and your bandwidth, you may or may not be able to use it. I apologize for that. But there's also a link to a DNR mailbox that you can send your comments to. You can send them to the director's office. You can send them to me. All three of those contacts are there.
Sure.
And that's the best way to get the information to us. Yes.
Sure. Okay, I'm sure some of our audience members have some questions. Why don't we do this? You don't have to sit there like a class and keep your hand up. I will see your hand go up, and we'll take one at a time, and you can ask your question. And use your teacher voice. All right, we don't have a roving microphone, so use your teacher voice so that they can hear, and we'll give the gentleman a chance to respond. Okay? Who would like to be the first to ask a question? Is there anyone? Yes, sir.
Listen, I was wondering if the DNR was going to allow them to put structures up, towers and such like that on the property. Is it just going to stay the way it is, and just with no structures, no towers, no radio towers and stuff?
So the management agreements that we have, short-term lease lands and the long-term, there is no provisions for permanent structures to be allowed. So, you know, when they do their training, they have temporaries as they're out there for their 2 weeks or during Northern Strike. That all comes down and it goes away. So no, part of, you know, their long-term lease, which is the one that's not what we're talking about, that area is where they do all their kinetic training. And so any of the structures that they've put on there, they've put stuff inside the restricted areas, inside the fences. They have a lot of infrastructure there. But even outside of there, they no longer have those towers. So no, they would not be allowed to do that.
Yes, ma'am.
Would they never be able to do that?
Correct.
Ever?
Yeah, that's what that lease agreement would say in writing, and we're held by that. And so.
And does that include fencing as well?
Yes, ma'am. We can't put up any and we don't have any desire for that. And I get your point, right? If there
right.
never
I mean,
fencing.
If it's good today, what does it look like in 5
right.
years or 10 years?
And if that ever happened, then a future Colonel Meyers would be sitting in front of all these audiences again, going through the same process again. And so that
or the non-answering DNR.
Well,
I mean, I've asked so many questions on that interactive map, and you know, made my comments. I've emailed. I haven't gotten an answer from anybody other than our governor, who said, "Ask the guy at the DNR."
In that lease agreement, will specifically say that in writing, okay. and all parties have to sign it.
But I mean, who enforces it though? I mean, it seems like, you know, the good stewards of this, you know, this land. I mean, I look at 25 years ago when we used to fish at Lake Marguerite. Now it's like, don't let the phone touch you, and you can't eat the fish, and you know, I mean,
that's not true.
What's not true?
You have. I ate some Lake Marguerite fish. Lake Margaret fished just a couple days ago. You can have 8 servings per day or per month. Some of those fish are less than what you can with the mercury that you find in the beautiful Blue Ribbon rivers that we have here. Not totally true. And I hate to say that for those property owners on that lake, because it's not true.
Not totally true or partially true or what?
There is PFAS contamination in Lake Marguerite, and they have found PFAS in every one of our bloodstreams because it was obviously made in many products. Anytime those old McDonald's wrappers, anytime you bought anything with Gore-Tex in it, any of you that bought a Teflon pan, anybody that waterproofing, it's all made with PFAS, right? So it's in all of us now. Now it's at higher levels of contamination that put out those fish advisories that you can have 8 servings of panfish per month before you have to concern yourself with it. But I would caution to say, but without touching the water and other things like that, because that's not true.
Yes. Anyone else have a
With
question?
that is large an area as we already provide, and Michigan provides, why do they need a larger area? You're saying, and there's so many aquifers and stuff, water areas. Why aren't they going out to some place like New Mexico where there's no, possibility of contaminating this many people in this area?
I think it's a great question. And so I guess a little bit, I didn't know we talked about PFAS, but and the only reason I sit on all those committees, I had to get smart with it, of course, when I got this position. The higher levels of contamination of PFAS, in my opinion, from the data of everything I've received, was based on the firefighting foam. This is a higher concentration. And so wherever we trained, and we trained not only military but our civilian firefighters with that foam, the training primarily occurred out at our airfield. And so what you're seeing throughout the country, including other air bases or airports, including Michigan, that they're just starting to put wells in to test for PFAS, is wherever that foam was used to either put out fires or train firefighters, that higher PFAS, our foam is what they're seeing, those spikes. And so what happened on the base is when they were done with training, they'd go to the fire barns and they'd go to the wash racks and they'd clean off that equipment. And that equipment, of course, would run out and drain down to just how water drains down to the lowest piece, and that was down by the lake. And so you can almost follow the hot spots of PFAS on the main post of camp and around the lake, specifically for where they were cleaning off those firefighting equipment with the foam.
That's exactly why
So I say that with saying we first of all, we no longer train with it.
Yeah.
Did we know that was harmful? Arguably no, right? And so we no longer train with it. We don't train with chemicals out in these areas, these short-term lease areas. Our presence would be less than what you see with a 4x4 and side-by-side traffic out there. We're talking rolling vehicles, troops walking around, camouflaged uniforms, tents with antennas up, but we're not going around using chemicals in these training areas whatsoever to train.
But again, why aren't they taking it out to some place like New Mexico, out in the desert?
Great
There's
question.
nobody out there.
So as we train for those other types of engagements, like I mentioned before, those are the areas exactly where we're training. Some of our national training center is out in the desert of Irwin, Fort Irwin, California. There's other Fort Bliss, Texas, and have huge desert areas that we do train for those desert conditions. But how do you train those warfighters in rolling hills? What does Eastern Europe's geography look like? It looks like exactly like northern Michigan, right? It has the same sandy soil, the same looking pine trees, the same rolling hills. So as we train our warfighters, we have to train in those types of environments, including in all season environments, not just the warm conditions of a desert. So I understand where you're saying, but we have to put our warfighters in those similar environments that they would potentially.
Most of our actions have been in the desert lately.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. Yes, ma'am, you have a question.
I am not a good speaker, but I'm wanting to say something about multi-domain operation. and when you talked about that, you talked about the Army, Navy, Air Force, everybody. Is that, I didn't know that every military was the same as the Army at
They're not, but we all train together simultaneously. So when we talk about those multi-domain operations, it's how are we successful within all those layers. So no longer can we just, train in the desert as a brigade-centric operation or tanks running across a wide open area or those types of things. How do you train alongside with the Air Force and the Navy and the Marines and how do you bring all of those elements to train simultaneously, and what kind of environments allow that? And so as we did that analysis of Camp Grayling, not only do you have the land piece that we're talking about this evening, but over that kinetic training area, that high impact area, is a very large restricted airspace. That airspace goes up on parts of it to 9,000 feet, other parts to 23,000 feet. So that allows those artillery rounds to shoot. Obviously, they're not going to interfere with civilian air traffic. It allows for jamming of different types of aircraft or other types of things. So, and then...
So are all those people and all those, they're at
Camp Grayling? Yes,
Camp
ma'am.
Grayling?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
So next year, so I talked about last year's, next year, they're starting their planning conferences right now for the next year's exercise. Again, it's a little bit less than this year right now. There's about 7,000 soldiers signed up. It represents 23 different states and the National Guard units. The Marines will probably come with another 1,000 again. We'll have Navy and Navy SEALs participating again this year. We'll have all components of the Army, National Guard, Army Reserves, and active duty, and we'll have a good Air Force contingent as well. So we all have to learn to not only train together, communicate together, and then you throw in your allied partners, right? The British and the Aussies and the Danes, and how do you communicate with those entities and train with them as well. So it's a very complex exercise that we do annually. The reason, one of the reasons we do it at Camp Grayling to make it a little bit, a lot of our military bases, our active duty bases are spread primarily throughout our southern states. There are some exceptions, of course, when you look at Fort Drum in New York and we have a National Guard Army Reserve base at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. Camp Ripley is in Minnesota. So we do have a smattering of other bases in the northern tier states. But how do you, active duty bases are full of the active duty soldiers who live there and train there. Their ranges are full. They have those huge footprints of those particular soldiers who live there full time. What's interesting to the National Guard and Army Reserve bases is we don't have a permanent presence. It's units rotating to train in, and then they rotate out. And so we have 8,000 beds out at Camp Grayling. We have the different areas of land use, the air use, all those other things that we talk about. So it allows all those different components where they can't necessarily do that at an active duty base to come to National Guard training facilities. So to put that's a bit of the why. There are certainly some...
what I know now from what you said is we're not the only ones that are doing this domain.
No, everybody's focused on certain pieces.
Multi-domain operation. We're not the only ones. They're all over.
Throughout the Army, like I mentioned in the National Defense Strategy, other installations are working on other pieces of those domains as well. But where can you train in all of them simultaneously? And that list quickly shrinks. And then you add the requirements of a 4-season environment with the airspace and the waterways like Lake Huron and other things that the Navy can do. You just don't have those capabilities that exist in the continental United States right now.
These are great questions. Let's keep them coming. Yeah.
What's the amount of years of short-term and long-term leasing on the property in our homes?
So the long-term is a perpetual. I don't think it has a sunset. I haven't seen a sunset in any of the language. It was established, like I said, in the late 30s, early 40s. So we're pushing, 80 to 90 years of use there. The short-term lease land, so it started in '84 as a 1-year use agreement, and then it went to a 10-year renewal, and now it's up to a 20-year renewal. It just renewed in 2018, and so the next renewal will be 2028 or 2038. So if anything gets put into a new one, that is always, that's a question that people have asked, is how long will that term be? We'll decide that it probably will be a shorter length, just so proof is in the pudding, and do what you say you're going to do, and then we'll review it, and it'll move on. So that one probably, it'll still be considered a short-term agreement, but it won't be lumped into the current 20-year that they have on. It'll have a separate time frame to it.
Like shorter?
Yeah, it'll probably be shorter.
I ask another question? So does it, even right now, does the watershed area get tested around Camp Grayling?
We have
On a
over
regular
270 wells on Camp Grayling, specifically attest to that. And then also at our ranges, because there was questions several decades ago about, we're shooting a lot of lead, right, in our artillery rounds into the impact areas. So what kind of effect is that having? And right now there's been zero effect of the groundwater for 100 years of training in those areas. So, but we have wells that get tested all the time. And right now, obviously, the hot button issue is PFAS, and so they were just out drilling more wells because we're trying to figure out exactly where that is, so we can do mitigation efforts or remediation.
So do you ever come up with a very much negative that's been reported or sinking into the watershed area that feeds our rivers?
The only ones that we found negative right now are the PFAS,
really?
and that's specifically right now around Lake Marguerite, the airfield, the Grayling Army airfield there is the highest contaminated area for us, and then they're trying to see where that spreads in the ground and that type of stuff.
Yes, sir. I've got two parts to this. You're talking about this property lease. I've spent the last 20 years through the parts of July riding up here, riding motorcycle trails. You guys have constantly been doing your, we call them war games, where your guys are out backpacking, camping. I've seen them. I rode by in the morning. They're setting up. I come by that evening and they're going off to another spot. What has changed from then till now with you wanting to secure this property in a different format?
Nothing. What we're doing is pushing that out further, right? So you would, if you're out riding the trails, I just ask folks all the time, we're not closing into these new lands. The road, we're required to use existing roads and trails, all those things. So you see service members just, I would prefer you wave to them and thank you for their service and go about your ride. However, it would be kind of the same thing. They would come out to a particular area, set up for a day, 2-3 days, and then move to a different area. And so you would, if this is approved, I think you'd really see very limited troop activity. Every one of those pixels on the maps aren't going to have troops in them. It gives the flexibility of those unit commanders to try and hide. Camouflage up. Ideally, you're not seeing a bunch of them. You might see them in the trails driving in, but then they'll set up, and then 3 days later they'll be gone.
We've never had a problem with any of the military we've interacted with out. It's never been a problem, but based off of the maps that are on the site and my own records for marking for different trail tours and stuff up here, I don't see a whole lot more property that you guys are marking off here that you haven't already been using.
We haven't.
Unless I'm missing something on my notes and my maps from over the years, on where I've seen troops at out, all the way to almost to Starvation Lake, Calcascaloo, all the way over to almost to Morristown, and then back up to over to Beaver Creek, which is just north of here. That's all area within the map. Now, I think some of this is going a little bit farther south towards Leota, that I don't know if you guys have been that far south, but most everything I see on the map is already grounds that you guys are using.
Well, what we're trying to do is put this in an actual language agreement for several reasons, of course. One of the big things is to not only hold ourselves accountable. The DNR says, you know, that way unit leaves that particular training area, we go through and inspect that area over the next couple of weeks, make sure it's left how it was, if not better. But that also allows us to bring, I don't bring a lot to this ask, right? Besides helping train our men and women. But there is some things I can bring to the table. If it's areas that we have an agreement, I can bring some federal resources. I can supplement some environmental type stuff. I can plus up fire services. I can plus up trails, right? So if it's trails or roadways that we use, then we can help maintain those. I can't pave roads. I don't have the ability to pave. People ask me all the time. But I can now take my military equipment out there, grade roads that if we drive a vehicle on. So there's some things now I can bring federal resources, but it's not a lot for what I'm asking for. But those are the handful of things. So as we developed this, we said, okay, what are we able to bring to the public based on this? And those are the lists of things that we can do. Typically environmental things, habitat things, improving habitats of environmental things. We can, work on cleanup projects. We can do road improvements. We can do those types of things as long as it's considered our training areas, and it has to go through a formal process. So we're trying to be good stewards there, and we're looking at ways. You mentioned you're a rider. We've expanded several thousand acres this past year. Myself, my family, we ride, we snowmobile. We love doing those activities as well. So we're always looking at ways as to where we can expand public use.
Yeah, the reason I made the trip was for that question, and just to make sure that there is no plan to close it off.
Yeah.
You're just going to keep doing the things you've been doing, which in my book is perfect for what you guys have been doing.
Right, so, these would roll into the short-term agreements, which that is the periphery in that southwestern part of Crawford.
Yes.
And so, like I mentioned earlier, anything that is allowed today will continue to be allowed in the future. Does it say there could be some roads closed because the DNR chooses to it? That's
not on me.
Yeah, that's through a different process.
He's cutting trees. He's doing other things you guys hate.
Yeah. We deal with that north of the Asabo sometimes when you guys are playing.
Right. When you get up, basically from, I'll say, Wilcox Bridge to Bald Hill Road, between north down on 612 and now north of 612, that's where the main closures are.
Yeah.
And so those have been the historical ones. So outside of that, that's the long-term area. Outside of that, we don't have that. So.
Sounds good to me.
Who's next? Yes, sir.
Would there be training going on during October and November when the deer hunting season are going on?
Their schedule is random. The majority of their training takes place during the summer. In the short-term agreement, it basically said there would be no training during rifle season, and that's been carried through since this was agreed or started in 1980s. And that was more for the safety of the troops, just because at that time we had close to 800,000 guys and gals in the woods hunting. And if you're camouflaged, you probably don't want to get shot at. So, there still will be training, just like there is now, on the current footprint, but most of their guys are also hunters, but it won't be restricted, no.
And with that being said, our training, our larger exercise, of course, Northern Strike's our largest exercise. This coming year will be the first 2 weeks of August. June is a typical busy month for us with our Michigan annual training, Ohio's annual training period. Usually it bleeds into a little bit of July. January, that's our winter strike exercise. It's another multi-domain training exercise, but a much smaller footprint, mostly up north there. This year there'll be less than, I think, 1,200 to put it in perspective. So a much smaller footprint. October for us is always the beginning of a fiscal year. And so units avoid training then because we never know when the federal government will pass a budget. And so when we're under a continuing resolution or something like we are now, that hurts some of that for training. So we typically avoid those months for financial reasons anyway. But yes, you know, the primary rifle season, it's almost a national holiday on the post because it's like a ghost town there anyway. But I would say, I don't know exactly where Tom slays all his birds, but I believe it's in a lot of the current long-term lease areas where our highest kinetic training happens anyway. So he's finding, I believe, most of that in those areas that we already have those longer-term lease where more military training happens.
Let's go to that.
Can I run one more question?
Well, let's see if someone else has asked a question. Go ahead.
I'd like to get back to the agreements. You talked about the long-term versus short-term and so forth. I sort of understand that. Historically, with the long-term, as things changed over time, in other words, if you allowed them to do things over time that the initial agreement didn't allow, I'm concerned a little bit with the short-term agreement. Because you have the two agreements between the DNR and obviously the camp, can you change, you enter into the agreement, and at some point in time, you change the agreement without the public knowing. Is there any chance of that?
So the long term, I will say no. You know, that document hasn't seen any amendments or revisions that I've seen through the paperwork that I have and through our document history, if you will. It was a very generic language that basically allows them to do their firing, their tank maneuvers. They can go anywhere. They can destroy habitat. They can, you know, it's training is number one, and that's how that was set up. The short term, there are avenues for amendments, but again, that would go to the director for his acknowledgement. So when I looked at the original 84 agreement to what we have today, during the review process or the renewal process, it has become longer and more restrictive than what it was in the beginning. Our leases, our agreements like this, you know, aren't subject to public input. You know, if we do an oil and gas lease with an oil and gas company, we don't send that out for public review. You know, our timber sale contracts are the same. So, you know, this may change that process. I can't say I'm not the process decider. I'm the guy who implements it if it is. You know, but so the long-term or the short-term agreement, excuse me, is reviewed annually. I sit down with the camp and with our wildlife staff and our parks and rec staff and our fishery staff, and we talk about, you know, we basically go over the agreement, kind of read through it, and then talk about what's going on. It's kind of all-encompassing planning for the year. If there is ever some amendments, like we do have an amendment out there now, basically removing the verbiage of deer yards because we don't acknowledge them anymore in Lower Peninsula, and the agreement has that in there with some archaic maps. And so just for housekeeping, that's out there, but that won't be, you know, we were gonna do that, and then he sprung this proposal on me, and that's kind of shifted our direction. So that's where that comes from. You know, in looking at it, it's been pretty interesting that it's the short term has stayed pretty consistent in the 35 years that it's been in existence.
Yes, sir.
So first of all, thank you guys for doing this today. I really appreciate it. I have a question kind of off of this gentleman behind me. So on the short-term lease agreement, there is a possibility that it can change. And the concern that I have is the communication that you would have with either the governments at border. So I live in Lyon Township, so you know that would be something that I would want to know as a resident. Do you then communicate to the municipalities if there is an amendment to that contract or that lease agreement that says, okay, this is what we originally signed, now we're going to change it to this, and do you then broadcast any communication to those municipalities that resides in?
I would say, you know, historically they probably haven't, because again, this hasn't been something that's been out for, you know, and again, I'll preface it, I have not been a part of a renewal. I came into the seat that I have in 2019, so the current one was all done and buttoned up before I came into my seat. So, but working in the office, I don't recall any, public comments. And so I would assume, like I said, the process may change because of this expansion, and it's one of those things that, we've kind of opened, we're cracking Pandora's box a little bit on how we may do things in the future. And if it does, then that's that's something we can consider.
Yeah, I think I might have misspoken. So I wasn't necessarily meaning public comments, but I was meaning more so that you would communicate to the government officials that reside in there. That
generally, if the Lyons Township does something that might impact us, I don't get those notices either. So I don't know. Again, it's I haven't been through that. It doesn't mean it couldn't happen. And that would be something open for discussion, and that would be a process change that we would do. It's no different than if we adjusted a timber sale next to your boundaries, we don't send those notices out. That's between us and the contractor. But to say it can't happen, everything's open to discussion.
And all of our lease agreements have been anything more restrictive, and how those annual reviews typically go. We'll go over our upcoming training year. The DNR, even though they don't have to, but they'll go over their timber sales in those short-term agreements, just so we're aware if we were trying to schedule training in those areas, and now there's going to be wood slaying happening, then they like to give us heads up, which we appreciate, right? So we know to take those areas off for training because there'll be lumbermen out there. Or if there's something in the environment that pops up. We found some new Kirkland warblers in a particular area. This past year there was some eagles that just nested and had some new eaglets, and so then we'll put a temporary boundary around that particular area so there won't be any training there. So with Tom's environmental crew, but we also have our own state employees and environmentalists on the post, and they also go out into those lands and look for those things. So that's part of that annual review, and that's really, it's not a big, secret by any means, but it's, a few hours or half a day that you're sitting down and kind of talking about those things or things that popped up, and then we'll just put circles on the maps to put those particular places off limits. With the eagles, it might only be for 4 to 5 months until the eaglet's at a certain age or what have you. But we look at all those different. The Turkey Federation comes out and plants different areas at our firing points and whatever to increase different habitat stuff. So we'll take those offline. They'll come in and do that. They do the snake, Massasauga, what do you call that? Snake rodeo, where they go out and tag them, and we have one of the largest in the state populations at a portion of the camp. So we'll shut down that area for trainings and put those dates on the map. So certainly anything on those agreements, the only thing we've ever seen is something more restrictive. It hasn't opened up additional things on the military side.
And I would follow up with two things. The camp has a camp community council, and so all units of government that have training grounds in their municipality is part of that, or has been invited.
Good to know. Okay.
So if this expansion would go out, obviously that council would expand to even greater portions. The other thing is if Lyons Township said we would like to know any changes that would come up, then we would put that into our system and say, all right, if we change this, here's who we need to notify. We do that with timber sales. If an adjacent landowner is concerned because they've seen paint, I ask for anybody if they want to come, if they're coming up to hunt, I ask them, do you want to be part of the notification? And they say yes. So we put that into the file. So do we automatically do it? No, but at request, yes, we do. So
in that base community council, we typically meet almost about every other month or so. I think we had to cancel the last one just because it was a holiday or some people couldn't come to it. But we talk about all those things. We talk about what the camp's doing right now, what our training is, what's coming up with that. We also post it out, of course, on all our social media. We do our range reports weekly on the radio that our community relations person gets out there and says what's happening in those areas that we do close, when they're closed. But we also talk about other stuff. We work with the community on how to go after different grants for different areas. We work with the different communities on the JLU study for roads, and we try and look at it as a whole of government approach as to versus every single township, every county chasing those same, big government dollars. How could we prioritize all of maybe 5 things that all of the local northern communities would agree upon to make something better for us? So we expand those units of government too. So absolutely, we're very open with what we're doing. We do a camp report, and then there's all the other forms of government that get up and talk about what they're doing. So be it the city of Grayling, be it the firemen, be it who's building new walking paths and trails, all those things kind of come together at that basic committee council meeting.
You really got into answering my question, but we live on Lake Marguerite, and every once in a while something starts going, all the, and we don't want the kids to go out in that, and it, to my knowledge, nobody told us that they were going to do some flying and some other kinds of stuff and put it on the lake. And
have they, like when the troops jump out of the back of the elevator?
Yeah.
We do announce that and put out there. We've had a pretty good relationship on the lake.
We probably don't know about it, but.
And we try and put it on the Lake Marguerite Property Association.
Yeah, if you can put it on Facebook, that might be.
Facebook's the devil.
No, don't go there.
No, it's important.
I didn't say that. Scott Meyers said that. Yeah, absolutely. And typically what we see, and sometimes we even ask the Lake Association for volunteers when we're doing some of those activities to you'll see different property owners come out with their pontoons. I know. Frankly, my wife does it. She'll take her pontoon out there, help block off that portion of the lake. During the summer, they enjoy watching the show kind of a thing, and then off they go. But typically that's done during our Northern Strike training, and we announce that, but we can certainly expand it to our social media. And typically we have a new community relations person. She started just under a year ago. She's been really good at putting stuff out, I know, on social media, and so we'll try and expand that for those upcoming things.
Well, and much like, answering the gentleman's question about being notified, if you can contact their community relations and say, can you put me on your email list? And so you may get more information than what you want, but you'll get that weekly training schedule, and it's very detailed on where they're gonna be and what they're, what if there's gonna be any closures, in the long-term area, and what's going on.
Especially on the lake, that would be helpful.
Yep. So.
Anyone else that hasn't asked the question yet? Yes, ma'am, I saw your hand up.
Yes, regarding, partly following up from the question that the gentleman asked regarding fixed structures, you mentioned there won't be any towers of any sort added. However, what about mobile units? More and more people have become aware in recent years of where this radiation causing health effects. I know of a number of people who have moved to rural areas such as this to escape the electrosmog as it is in the cities now. So what assurance can we have that people who are affected, disabled in some senses if they're exposed to these levels of radiation, that there won't be like millimeter waves, essentially like they have in the cities with the 5G towers now, used flying overhead of homes,
I think that's a great question, right? And I would argue probably this all day, or hours in bed watching TikTok videos, which I'm sometimes guilty of. It's probably we'll find out 20 years from now that that's a bad thing. But whenever we do anything in the spectrum, and what that means is any of those radio waves or signals or any of that type of activity, we have a complete spectrum management office. We have to send our spectrum to be approved. Not only, it has several approvals, not only through the military side, but it goes to the FAA. Last thing they want, of course, is anything that would interfere with air traffic and civilian populations and all those types of things. And where would they want to do some of that training? They don't want the interference from, or provide a hindrance. So the waves that they operate on, can't interfere with your phones or your Wi-Fi signals or those types of things, because they're specifically trying to operate at different frequencies away from folks. So they're trying to find those remote areas with those signals that will not travel as far. Most of the training we've been doing on that so far has been in our 30 complex, our fenced-in areas, so we can really control those boundaries and limit either that through power, because that's one way that you manage spectrum, or through which level of spectrum or frequency that you operate in. I will warn you that I believe 5G is coming to an area near you and it has nothing to do with the military. As new technologies develop and everything else, the community is demanding it. They want better Wi-Fi access, they want better signal even in rural areas. Every single community I see around in northern Michigan is asking for better rural Wi-Fi, and that's going to do exactly what you're saying.
Well, yeah, no doubt. And by the way, there are many studies out there showing the damage. All biological beings are harmed in some way. Not everyone feels it right away. Some could take 20 years, like you said. Birds, wildlife, there's even Newsweek magazine did an article a couple years ago warning that with the higher frequencies that 5G will be using, that likely birds and other wildlife, cows have been affected, and there have been lawsuits in some countries already in Europe. But
I think I do think the science is not fully developed for sure.
Right.
However, we have to go and manage every spectrum, every radio signal. And some of that training, like I talked about, when we talked about multi-domain operations, we talked about electronic warfare, carrying around a cell phone in your pocket, every time you key up a radio, emits RF signature, right? And so what we found, even before what we've seen in Ukraine, but certainly we've seen it more in Ukraine, is how quick our service members or militaries can be targeted just by their RF signature. So carrying around a cell phone, even when you're not actively using it, is emitting an RF signature. And so that's harmful for a warfighter if we can be detected that quickly. So we have to think of other ways to combat that. So how do we not use this? How do we spoof? How do we make it look like there's RF signature when there's not? So we're working on some new technologies to try and figure that out with some industry folks. How do you look at those signatures that you kind of describe and protect our military from that? Because there are satellites from space that can pick up that signature within a couple of minutes. And so camouflage, where we just wear a camouflage uniform, isn't the same with the new technology. So how do we train in those types of environments are the things that we're working on.
Yes, ma'am. I think you were next.
Oh, I was just going to ask about the frequency, and she kind of covered that too, but I was concerned about what would that shift look like with the natural habitats that are there currently. It's somewhat residential in some of the areas, and so that was kind of what I had concerns over, is with
we're not going to do training by someone's backyard. That doesn't line up that well with our training. And again, we made the map and some of those pixels as big as we could, specifically to bring those federal resources, because that's about the only thing we're bringing to that table. That map, of course, will reduce a little bit. We'll have boundaries away from private properties and those types of things. But the last thing we want to do is jam somebody's phones or Wi-Fi signals. And even what we're seeing in Eastern Europe right now, that military is dependent upon civilians for information, right? So people might think, yeah, we'll just go jam all the radios, but that doesn't, or it doesn't help us when our biggest intelligence is coming from civilians on a battlefield in Ukraine right now, right? So when you look at the Ukrainian army and you look at those civilian populace, they're the ones that are feeding their army information for how to defend certain areas. So we have to figure out how do we work with the civilian populace, and that's why it doesn't help us to close anything. We're okay with having civilian interaction as long as you guys are. Don't be offended if you see somebody carrying, wearing the uniform and carrying a gun, because they need to train on how best to work with the civilian population too. Because wherever we have deployed, I've deployed several times. I've been in very urban areas. I've been in hostile activity before. We depend on the civilian regardless of where we're at.
Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
Just to kind of back up, but on what these ladies are pointing out, the most concerning thing to me is the private industry that you're gonna be bringing into the base to test things. I would hazard to say that you can't be transparent about exactly what you're using or how you're using it, especially if a private industry is giving you the machinery or the technology to use. So how will the public, I don't want to say protect themselves, but how will we know what we're being affected by if you can't see it, smell it, taste it?
Good question. So, to be fair, we're not opening up these additional lands for private industry. We do bring in private industry all the time at Camp Grayling. Arguably, the warfighter has been working with private industry before World War I, right? So wherever troops are training, if you've got the HIMARS rocket guys, you'll typically have somebody from Lockheed Martin there trying to figure out from those soldier touch points what'll make it better, what'll make their systems more effective, how to, from a soldier perspective, what does that look like? You work with different radio system. You'll typically somebody from Raytheon will be there asking those same types of things, trying to get after those challenges. I think the fear is just not warranted from what I get to witness. But certainly I understand the concern too. Just to give you an example of some of the industry stuff that we worked with at Northern Strike this year. One of the best breakthroughs that we were working with was, I can't think of the company right now, but what it was is, those goggles that the gamers, the kids wear, you've probably seen them on videos or whatever. They're working with that technology to put that on, and so if somebody is wounded in combat, they can put that on and be talking to an ER doctor or a doctor at U of M across the globe who can give them advice, life-saving advice. So if it's just a basic medic or even a soldier, that doctor could see that point of injury and physically talk to that person and walk them through that type of care. That could change how we do rural America, healthcare. If our fire department, our police department had some of that technology that you could provide that care, you're getting a U of M, doctor being able to provide that. And so I think a lot of times when we think of industry, we think of the worst potential case scenario. I guess that's a fair place to start.
Sometimes
a
things
discussion.
are unintentional.
Yep, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
But arguably, from what I see, it's not that. And these new areas, those aren't areas that the industry wants to come out. They want a controlled environment. Those fenced-in areas that we have, our urban training areas, which we call the CACTIF, which is our 30 complex. Those tunneling areas we have in those training areas, those are the areas that they want to come out to. Our firing points when they're shooting the weapon systems, those are the areas that industry comes. And they have to pay us what we call incremental cost recovery fees, so it's not free chicken for them, right? But their biggest advantage is they want those touch points from those training, how to make those things better and make the warfighter more capable. So I would hesitate. There's no massive conspiracy with industry. We've been working with industry since the early 1900s. But I understand the concerns, and some of the stuff they're working on certainly is classified because we don't want that in our enemy's hands. But it's not as everything I've seen, and I get to see all of it. I go out there physically, walk the dirt, even on the classified stuff. It's probably not my good thing.
It's not harmful to the public.
No, ma'am. I'm standing right there beside it. So, but fair question.
Yes,
well, and one thing, just as a follow-up, I'm sorry, is go back to when I talk about different ownerships. So, on the short term right now, there's nothing in that, and that might be a touch point where we specifically say there's not to be any subleasing on short-term lands. Long-term, like I mentioned before, number one goal is military training, and so that's a little bit more vague on what can happen out there. But as the colonel said, the fenced-in areas, a lot of that is their own property. So we, as a DNR, when people ask us, what are you going to, I can't control who goes on their property. That's their responsibility. So, the things that we can control is the short term. The long term, like I said, If it got to that point, then our lawyers would have to get involved with that. But the short term is we develop it through, and it's been a concern, and it's an understandable concern. That could be one of those touch points that we put into that guideline if we ever get to that.
And we haven't asked for, nor do I ever anticipate us ever. It's just not the desire of those industries for that short-term lease type of areas. So it's just not what they're looking to do.
Yes, ma'am.
There's some significant evidence that if you get this additional land, you'll sublet it to for-profit groups for military.
Yeah, that's what we just talked about. We can't do that.
Even with the long term, you can't do that.
Now, long term, we do allow industry to come in. Again, they have to pay, but it has to have a nexus for our interests as well.
So short term, you can't.
Yes, ma'am. Correct.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Dave, thanks. Appreciate you gentlemen coming tonight. Last week we heard one of your servicemen was here in this building, talked to the Historical Society about the history of the camp, and it was interesting, but we didn't get into this project. But so I got a couple questions, Dave, if you don't mind. It might take a minute or two, but I'll get it all done at once. Number one is I know in the big picture, military is very important. When I see what's going on in Ukraine and the Russian aggression over there, and these poor people, civilians dying every day, and they're an ally of ours, and as all of Europe is, and I'm glad we're doing whatever we can and maybe more. So I think the training and whatever we're doing that relates to those kinds of events is very important. So what you're doing and additional training is very, very important, so I support that 100%. But I do have concerns sometimes. We're kind of the headwaters of several river systems here, the Manistee, the Asable, and the Muskegon. So, and I know that the Deadstream Swamp area, which is really cool in terms of natural features, I think is part of what your expansion area includes, maybe down to 55. I haven't seen the map, but I believe you're kind of coming southwards along, say, the 27 corridor, maybe to 55, maybe even south of that. So that will include a lot of that sort of that Deadstream area, which is a lot of it's left undeveloped. There's some oil rigs and stuff out there, but it's pretty wild country. Bear and huge snapping turtles, you name it, it's out there. Will your activities have any impact, you think? And I guess maybe that ties to another question I have is, and I think you've sort of alluded to the fact that you use environmental people and biologists within the DNR that give you guys feedback and maybe ask questions. How much is that all being considered? In other words, the natural and environmental aspects of what your activities involve in the coverage area you're going to be having.
So I'll go just because it's pressure in my mind and I'll forget. He gets long-winded. So if we get to the point where we're doing the environmental assessment and any of our processes, whether it's allowing the oil and gas exploration down there or development or establishment, all of our other divisions have to sign off on this. So everything that this expansion will go through, it's department-wide. The wildlife division will have to sign off. They'll do their own look at it. The forestry division will do their look at it. Fisheries will have input. Parks and Rec division will have input. So yes, and that will be part of that review, and it may come up when the Deadstream is part of their ask. It may come up during that review that they say, you know what, the training is not compatible for this sensitive area or this type of area. And it may be us saying, you know what, we appreciate it, but we're going to have to pull this out. And so that's part of the process that we're going to go through. Have we hit that yet? No, because I'm still waiting for the director to give that thumbs up to start saying, all right, now we start disseminating this out to the other divisions, because I really don't think it's fair for us to put a lot of resources into it if it's going to be dead in the water, more or less. So that will come into play. Whether it's looking at, another area that is part of their large ask is the Kirtland Warbler essential habitat. So, we'll have to have discussions with wildlife and the Kirtland Warbler Management Group to say, is this a compatible use with the type of training that they're looking to do? And so, we look at that from everything from an ORV club coming out to do a ride, to the oil and gas companies to come out to our timber sales. All that goes through that type of review process, and where we can mitigate it and we can coexist, we do. If it's not something that is compatible with the treatments that we want to do or the activities we want to do, they don't get done. We site condition it because it's environmental, because it's maybe a historical, archaeological site. So it'll be the same process. So that would be us. And their NEPA process would do the same thing. Their NEPA process is going to go through and examine and say, all right, what's out here? How does this fit with our training and so on and so forth. So it'll be, you know, both entities will do that process in their separate ways. But yes, it is very much looked at and it's taken very seriously.
But sometimes we're limited too, right? So we get that, when they do that compatibility study, what kind of activity is compatible with that particular environment? Now arguably, the land on those maps does include middle of swamp areas that we don't have a desire of training in. But once again, I'm trying to take full advantage of any federal resources that I can bring on, and that's probably where the NEPA process would limit me to, because they'll see I'm trying to bring federal resources, but that's where you can potentially help with invasive species or invasive habitats or those types of things. So yeah, we don't have any interest in being out in the middle of those swamps per se, but we did include those on the map for other benefit.
I was going to say, what would be your training purpose for being in, say, swampy areas, unless you're doing some?
No, I'm trying to bring, you know, some of the value that we can bring, but we're not going to be out there now. And I think we mentioned this early on, but under the short-term lease agreements, we're held to existing roads and trails. We're held to existing open areas to set up if we live whack in those areas. So we can't go clear a bunch of area and do all those other things. We have to fit within that environment of how it is. So being in the middle of the swamp doesn't have a lot of training value for us.
Just one other thing, Dave, you talked about some more public forums. I know online, it sounds like online there's some opportunities, although the lady was saying that she's not getting answers, but are there public forums where, like this, going to be announced where people can come and sit and ask questions kind of organically?
We've done a lot of these.
You've done a lot of them? Okay,
yes,
I haven't heard of all these.
Well, you know, so our department, we did the big one in June 22nd. And that was the one that the department said we're going to host. So after that, municipalities and other groups came to either the colonel or myself and said, would you be willing to come and talk to our group? And that's what we've done. You know, those have been the discussion points. You know, the comments, I mean, if you have specific questions, I would say email them to me. I will respond to your emails. You know, it's the public, you know, comment, interactive comment is that's what it was set up for, were comments. And you know, if there's questions, we'll try and get through them, but you know, it's not the easiest to weed through them all. So if you have questions, send them to me. I'll be glad to answer them for you, or call me. I'll be glad to answer it over the phone. As we go forward, like I said, if and when we hit the milestones, I would say, you know, after, well, the NEPA will have public comments, those will be announced. You know, if we get to a lease agreement, language drafting, that will be a larger group, and whether or not we have more than just the one, that will be at the discretion of my bosses. I'm not the one who sets that planning schedule.
We just have
I'll have these gentlemen come back January, February to give us an update.
Okay.
How's that?
Perfect.
You bet.
Can I just get one quick one?
Sure, go ahead.
In the lease system you guys have, is this just like I mean, the DNR is agreeing to let the military use it, or is the military paying for that lease?
No, because we're two state entities. So the current lease agreement that we have, of that 42,000 acres that is part of the short-term lease lands, I think all but maybe, don't quote me, probably 2,000 acres is tax reverted.
Right.
So Treasury pays that swamp tax.
Yes.
So what the military reimburses our division or the DNR is any of the properties that were purchased with other funds. So, you know, whether it be state game fund or if it was, you know, whatever else fund that's out there, that's the value that comes back. So there is no, and basically you're taking from Peter and giving to Paul.
No, I understand.
You know, but yeah, there's no monetary really tied to it.
Okay.
Well, you know, they'll say
Sorry.
is if you know that they will come, do you, I know you can't foresee the future, but I'm kind of hoping that doesn't mean like 9,000
People are here all the time? No.
Yeah, and then now, next year, or, 10 years down the road, it becomes 20,000.
No, so great question, and we had this discussion internally as well. That is not the intent. And so the infrastructure at the base, it's like I said, about 8,100 beds available for transient unit use. So they'll go out and do field activities and they'll kind of come back, do maintenance activities or other things at the base. That is kind of our maximum number, that 8 to 10,000. Back in the 80s and 90s, we'd have 10 to 12,000. But that sweet spot for what we have infrastructure capabilities is maybe up to 10,000 if we put up a lot of tents. But really that 8, maybe 9,000 range on the high end. Our exercises take a ton of planning. You bring a lot of people on military orders to plan them. That money is of course finite. It takes a lot to put on a large exercise. We don't anticipate it. Now, what we do foresee is those main training times that we currently have would absolutely. I do anticipate winter strike growing. There are some more threatening areas in the Arctic-like conditions, and we are much cheaper to get to than Alaska for training. So I think we'll see an increase of winter training in January. I don't see a huge increase in training in August or June because those are kind of those areas. So what you'll really end up seeing is I guess it depends where you're at. If you've never seen troops training in a particular area, you might now, but you'd see a dilution of troops because that number will be diluted amongst greater acreage. So I argue that if everything goes to how I'm asking for, you would really rarely see the troops in those areas, and then it'll be all about nothing from a
It's hard to say that we're 20 years from now when you're retired and.
Yeah, I just don't anticipate.
Future, but I guess that'd be up to the DNR.
Well, to put on those things cost a bunch and all that other stuff, and so we've even talked about in certain areas with the final lease language, because that was a question that's come up a few times. Do we limit the number of troops in particular areas so it's not heavily populated? So those are helpful comments and things we are working at. Is okay, because really I'm not. When we looked at this original ask, we weren't talking about large formations going out to those areas. We have those types of training areas. I have the tank trails already. I have the impact areas already. I'm trying to get out and give those units maximum areas to go and hide, if you will, in one area for 2 to 3 days, and another area getting out those greater distances and keep moving around with their wheeled vehicles, and they'll have antennas to talk, and hopefully it'll be nice and camouflaged so it's hard to see them and all that type of stuff. But it's really for smaller size organizations versus the larger footprint. Because as we see that warfare changing a bit, it's pretty easy to target larger formations. So how can you bring that same type of effect that we've always had with larger formations in smaller groups moving around the battlefield? So you're not going to see masses of troops in any of those particular areas. I think the most might be 50 to 100 in a particular area, and that'd be on the high side. They'll probably typically be much smaller elements out the woods.
Yes, sir.
I'm a little confused exactly. I'm interested in the Lyon Township, Roscommon, that goes down to the Muskegon, that section right there. Now, what kind of training would you be doing in there? It's not, you're speaking of foot training and stuff, but it's anything I've seen. It seems like it's going to be electronic or something other than foot training.
It's the same. So think of a military version of a side-by-side going down.
So it's basically troops and foot. It's not
Troops,
radio wave stuff and stuff like that.
Certainly some of that, right? So we will train, all our troops, carry radios. That absolutely will happen. We'll try and jam those frequencies of those troops training to disrupt their communications, to contest their areas. So they have to figure out, because as we develop training, you got to get those basics right before you go into that kinetic in a live fire area like what we have in those kinetic areas that I mentioned earlier, those fenced-in areas, those live fire areas. So you have to figure out how to work within a contested environment, which might mean we're trying to jam them, we're trying to spoof them, do different effects to them in those environments. But yes, most of it, troops walking in the woods, but they're obviously all radioed up. Side-by-side vehicles, wheeled vehicle movements on those roads, setting up overnight bivouac sites with tents that have camouflage. Those are the types of things you'd potentially see in specific areas.
Anyone else? I saw your hand move. You want to go? You have a question?
Sure.
Go ahead.
I just want to be clear on this. What you want to decide by the end of the year is whether or not you're going to use Camp Grayling. Is that?
No, the decision that.
Or has that already been made, that it
No.
definitely will be?
No, the decision, that we're awaiting is whether or not we're moving to the next phase to look at the environmental assessment.
Okay, so you haven't really decided that for sure it's going to be Camp Grayling?
Correct.
Okay, from what I understand, Camp Grayling is the biggest, is one of the bigger, if not the biggest camps in the country? True?
Well, not exactly. So there are certainly other military installations that are larger than Camp Grayling. Camp Grayling is the largest National Guard base. Right now, east of the Mississippi, we were the largest in the nation. I think Gowan Field might be either the same size or a few thousand acres larger. That's out in Idaho, I think. But because it's tied to a different training facility.
Yeah.
But we are for sure one of the largest footprints, and so.
Okay, so is that why you're looking at it then? Because what about like Montana or Idaho? I mean, they would have a similar terrain, and the temperatures are similar in the winter.
So Idaho a little bit, Montana not really, but it gets into those other domains as well. So we're hosting these discussions focused on the land piece, but that air, that sea, that other thing, that forest environment absolutely plays into it. And then you tie that in where there's a base with infrastructure, to build a new camp.
Well, you already have the infrastructure.
Yeah,
so.
To build a camp in the middle of nowhere
will cost more money.
Billions of dollars, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Who's next? This is great, by the way. Thank you so much for coming with your good questions. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
You can host, up to, 10,000 soldiers. You can do all this. Why can't it just stay where it is? I mean, I don't understand why, right over here on, 127, you're talking about 52,000 acres.
Yeah, and to be fair,
I mean, that's just.
I think that gets lost, right? So all that land is still going to be owned by you and the DNR, right? We're asking to be able to use some of that acreage. And are we going to use all that 52,000 acres on any given training location? No.
I mean,
but it gets us that distance and those things that I was trying to stress. Do we use every square pixel of acreage that we have today? That argument's no. There are areas that we would have trained at Northern Strike this year that maybe we hadn't trained within 3 years prior.
Right.
So it's giving that flexibility and that distance to those training in those spaces. So I get the argument. If you just manage the acres you have today, would that not be enough?
I mean, I'm sorry. I live in Gerrish Township. I'm looking at $130,000 septic system to save our lake. And yet, on the other side of the lake in Lyon Township, you're talking about, making this part of your camp. That concerns me.
Well, and I don't think it should. I think we can absolutely train our forces and protect those interests of northern Michigan. I think when you look at what the military training will be, it's going to be much less intrusive of what you see with current recreational activities that are happening in those exact same areas. We're not doing any live fire or tank trails or any heavy maneuvering or any of that type of stuff.
Are they going to have loaded weapons? that's.
No, they won't have loaded weapons in these areas either. They will be carrying weapons. They'll be carrying, you know,
But they're not loaded.
They're not
I mean,
loaded.
I've come across where somebody's, you know, left everything and just kind of walked away from it.
Yeah,
You
no,
know,
no
on the
loaded,
trails.
no loaded weapons. There's no live fire areas in that. They load their weapons with live munitions when they're getting ready to shoot live targets or
Okay,
that types
all right.
of things. So I think it's very, very minor intrusiveness based on what you'll actually physically see, but it gives those units those flexibilities. So somebody asked before, if you're just trying to get out to distance, why don't you just pick a point in a distance and say that's the area to train? Well, that's very difficult because now we all know where they're going to be, right? And so so you have to figure out what is that? How do you best train those service members in those types of environments? So that's what we're trying to do is that flexibility. But will you see troops in all 52,000 of those acres on any given year? No. That answer is going to be no. It's giving those flexibilities. You might see them a few days out of the year, and then you might see them at this point for 2 days, and then you might see them, 15 miles away on the next 2-3 days. So I think you're going to find that it's very, very.
Well, of course, because we're now spreading it out, but I'm just thinking, I mean, the best reference, I guess, is the camp size right now is the size of Guam. No, we can't find somewhere to, I mean, I just, it's not even for me. I mean, I look at my grandchildren, they're the ones that I want to grow up in northern Michigan and be able to go to Higgins Lake and see the bottom of it and not see foam and, PFAS. And I want them to be able to go on the rivers and fish and.
Well, I grew up on Higgins Lake, camping at South Higgins Lake every year. My grandmother was on the Muskegon River, right there on the other side of 27. Those are those exact same areas that my family grew up with and loved as well. And put in another perspective, you might have a grandchild or a great-grandchild someday that decides to join the military.
Oh, we come from a military family.
You're damn well going to want them to be the best trained they can be there with all go in harm's way. So what we're trying to do is balance that, right? How can we protect those interests exactly like you mentioned, same things that are extremely valuable to my personal family while training those service members? How can we do both? And we think we can do it if we write this language the best way possible. I prefer the longer lease from my perspective because then we put that in writing for this much longer. This is what it says. So that's from my perspective that we could submit exactly what we say into that language. However, I understand the other concerns on the other way, so we'll go with the flow, I guess. But how do you do both? How can we protect our best interests that we all love while ensuring our service members are best trained as well?
And I would just add on to that, I think the people who have sat in my seat, years before and been part of the management and co-management and working with the military, obviously our job is to look out what's best for the environment, what's best for the resource.
Right.
And I think those managers have done a good job. The last one was here for 25 years and dealing with the military and everything. And so, we wouldn't stay in our job very long if we weren't looking out for the best of the environment. And, we have a lot of asks that come to us, and every time we are looking at what is that risk, what is that potential impact from timber sales to oil and gas to recreational users to the military. And, it's not something that I take lightly and any of our managers take lightly, and that is our number one goal. And, there have been times where the military has come, even on the long-term lease lands, where their activities are number one, and they say, hey, we want to do this activity. I'm like, no, because you're going to disturb the soil. We have issues with invasive species. It doesn't make sense to me, basically. It doesn't, what hair I have on the back of my neck stood up. And that's part of my job. And that's the relationship that all the managers have had with the military is, all right, hey, we would like to do this. It's within our purview, but we want your permission to do that. And if it's not best for the environment, that's my job to stand up and say no. And it's my job to make that known. If I get trumped and he says, Tom, I don't like your opinion, I'm going to your boss, that is his right. And it's up to my boss to make that decision. But I will let my opinion be known.
We've never had to go that step.
Right, but that's just, you know, so that's.
If Tom says no, we're usually pretty quick to back up.
So far, you know, and it's part of, but it's part of that relationship. I worked in the unit for 11 years and been, you know, involved with the military on, you know, inventorying their properties and working with them, setting up sales. So, you know, and that's why I'm sitting in this seat, because of that experience that I've had with them and working with them. But, you know, it kind of gets lost in the shuffle that it seems like we don't care about what's going to happen. It's just the military says it, we're going to let it happen. That's not the case. We take this very seriously, and, you know, whether it's oil and gas or the military, anybody else, we are all putting them through the same system. Any type of chemical application on our property, whether it's a power company, utility company, tree trimming companies, the military, any other partnering agencies that want to help us, they all have to follow our guidelines. That all has to come through us. They have to fill out a pesticide application plan. It has to be approved by our folks. It has to be approved by all the other divisions as well. Again, it's just not one entity saying you can sign off. So, you know, people that fear that, you know, the unit manager sitting in the seat can just kind of go off on his own and do things, you're not going to be in that seat very long. I mean, I could try it, but I'm going to be out that door pretty quick, because that's not our policy.
It's pretty big bureaucracy.
It is, and that's our job. You know, I love the outdoors. That's why I'm in this position. I love to hunt, fish, camp, kayak, whatever. All those values, that's why we're here.
Right.
And that is my job to help protect that. And part of that is, yeah, you know, we don't know what the future is going to hold, but part of my job is to ensure whatever's put into place, if this gets that far, it's pretty well documented and written so it withstands any other challenges as it goes forward, good or bad.
So, any chemical units that come in, they go through you?
Yes, if the military if the military is looking to put any chemical on the ground, they have to fill out and go through our pesticide application process on lands that we own, so the long term or the short term.
The only thing that I can think of, actually, since I've been the chair, and it was asked of us, it was Lake Marguerite, actually, no foil treatments. Because the camp surrounds half the base, we pay for half of those treatments to keep that invasive species. But those are things, again, public asks, DNR asks, hey, military, would you be willing to pay half of this for this particular invasive species or whatever? Those are some of the things that I can kind of remember.
You can do?
And we do. We pay actually more than half this past year.
Anyone else?
Very respectful audience, really appreciate your questions.
Listen, I want to thank these gentlemen for coming, and more importantly, I want to thank you for coming out to this.